Hi everybody. Story time. So, where have we got to? Mr. Grundy's has run from the bank because Emil could prove that the notes that Mr. Grundy's was trying to exchange were the notes that he'd stolen from Emil, because they had a hole through them where Emil had attached the notes to the inside of his jacket. At this, the thief turned round and, quick as lightning, shoved a way through the boys so violently that several stumbled and fell over. Then he bolted through the door and was gone. "After him!" cried the manager, and everyone made for the door. But when they got outside, they saw that the thief had been stopped by more boys. They held on to his arms and his legs and his coat. He struggled wildly to free himself, but the boys were too many for him. In the nick of time, a policeman came running towards them. Pony had ridden off on her bicycle to fetch him. "Arrest that man," said the bank manager. "We have reason to believe that he is a train thief." The cashier ran back to fetch the money and the pin and asked for time off. Then he and the policeman, with the thief between them, set off to escort Grundy's to the police station, followed by something like 100 boys. Pony pedalled along beside them for a time, but when they came to a turning, she called out, "Goodbye, Emil, old boy. I must be off home to tell them all about it." "Okay," said Emil. "Give them my love and say I'll be in for dinner." As she turned away, she called over her shoulder, "I say, you do look like a school outing." With which she rode off, ringing her bell madly as usual. Chapter 15. Police Headquarters. That odd procession marched on to the nearest police station, where the policeman who had taken the thief in charge reported the affair to the duty sergeant. Emil filled in many of the details and had to give his name and address, and the date and place of his birth, and the sergeant wrote it all down in his big ledger. A ledger is a big book. "And what's your name?" he asked the thief. "Herbert Kiesling," said the man. At this, Emil, Gustav, and the professor, who had come in with him, all laughed out loud. The cashier, who had just handed over the £7 to the sergeant, joined in. "He's a fine one," said Gustav. "First he says his name is Grundy's, then Müller, and now Kiesling. I'd like to know what it is, really." "Silence," growled the sergeant. "We shall soon find out what his real name is." Then Mr. Grundy's Müller Kiesling gave his address as the hotel cried, and told them when he had been born and where. He said he had no identity papers. "And where were you before you arrived here yesterday?" asked the sergeant. "In Gross-Grünau," said the thief. "I bet that's another lie," said the professor. "Silence, you," boomed the sergeant. "Every statement will be checked in due course." The cashier asked if he could go then. But first he too had to leave his name and address. He patted Emil on the shoulder encouragingly and went back to work. "Now, Mr. Kiesling," continued the sergeant, "did you steal £7 from this schoolboy, Emil Tischbein of Neustadt, yesterday afternoon while in the train to Berlin?" "Yes," the thief now admitted glumly. "I don't know what made me do it. He was asleep in the corner and the envelope with the money fell out of his pocket. I picked it up and meant only to look inside and see what it contained, and then, having no money—" "That's not true either," Emil exploded. "I pinned the money into my inside pocket. It couldn't possibly have fallen out." "And he can't say he had no money," put in the professor, or he'd have had to use Emil's to pay for all he ate and drank at that cafe, and for the taxi he took after that." "You boys must not interrupt," roared the sergeant. "We'll check everything in good time." And he wrote a lot more down in his book. "I should be much obliged if you could let me go now, sergeant," said the thief with extreme politeness. "I've admitted my mistake, and you know where to find me. But I'm in Berlin on a matter of business, and would like to go now and attend to it." "You've got a nerve," said the sergeant, and lifting the telephone, he rang the police headquarters and asked them to send a car to collect a train thief who had been caught in that district. "When will I get my money back?" Emil asked anxiously. "You'll have to go to police headquarters for that," replied the sergeant. "It'll be settled there." "I say, Emil," whispered Gustav, "I expect you'll go in a Black Maria." Now, a Black Maria is the name given to a police van. "Nothing of the kind," said the sergeant. "Have you got any money, young Tischbein?" "Yes, sir," said Emil. "The boys collected some for me yesterday, and the hall porter at the Hotel Cried lent me 10 shillings. "Well, upon my word, you know your way about, don't you, you young rascals?" growled the sergeant. But it was a good-tempered growl. "Very well then, Tischbein. Take the Underground to Alexander Square and report to Sergeant Ludwig there. Then you'll hear what's to happen next, and no doubt get your money back." "Would it be all right if I go and give the porter back his 10 shillings first?" Emil asked. "No, perfectly." The police car arrived a few minutes later, and Mr. Grundy's was told to get in. The sergeant gave a copy of his report, with the £7, to the policeman on duty in the car. The pin was attached to the report too. Then the car drove away. Crowds of children were still hanging about on the pavement, and they shouted after the thief, but he took no notice. Indeed, he put his nose in the air as if he was quite proud of being seen driving in such a car. Emil shook hands with the sergeant and thanked him for his help. Then he told the boys outside that he would be getting his money back at police headquarters and that the hunt was over. At that, they all went streaming off together like a flock of sheep. Only the inner core of detectives went with Emil to the hotel and onto the Underground station to get his train to Alexander Square. "Don't forget to ring up Little Tuesday," he reminded them, and let him know what's happened. He thanked them for helping him and hoped he'd see them again before he went home. "I have to pay back the money you all lent me too," he ended up. "Just you try to give the money back, that's all," said Gustav. "And I'll just about... Oh, that reminds me, we still haven't had our fight. You know, about your funny old suit?" "Oh, I'm so happy," said Emil, seizing hold of Gustav with one hand and the professor with the other. "Let's call the fight off. I'm so grateful for all you've done. I couldn't bear to hit you." "You wouldn't get the chance," Gustav boasted cheerfully. In the end, the three boys went together to police headquarters and were taken down long corridors and past a great many closed doors to the office of Sergeant Ludwig of the Criminal Investigation Department. He was just eating his mid-morning lunch when they were announced. "Uh-huh," said the sergeant, with his mouth full. "Emil Stulbein, amateur detective. We had a phone call about you. The superintendent wants a word with you. Come with me." "My name is Tischbein," Emil corrected him. "Oh, well, it's much the same thing," said the sergeant, taking another bite out of his sandwich. "We'll wait for you here," the professor said to Emil. "Don't be long," added Gustav. "It makes me frightfully hungry to see anyone munching away like that." Sergeant Ludwig led Emil down more corridors. He turned left, then right, then left again, and finally knocked on a door. A voice called, "Come in," and the sergeant turned the handle and, still munching, announced, "The young detective, Emil Fishbein. You've had information about him, sir." "My name is Tischbein," Emil said again. "Oh, it's quite a good name too," mumbled the sergeant, giving him such a shove that he almost fell into the room. The superintendent was a pleasant man. He made Emil sit down in a comfortable armchair and tell him the whole story, very carefully, from beginning to end. "I see," he said gravely, when Emil had finished. "Well, now you shall have your money back." "Oh, thank goodness for that," said Emil, heaving a great sigh of relief as he put the notes away in his pocket. And he was very careful indeed this time. "Now don't let anyone else steal them," said the superintendent. "I certainly won't," Emil promised. "I'm going to take them straight to my grandmother." "No, that's right. I'd almost forgotten about her. Now, I must have your Berlin address. I suppose you'll be staying there for a few days longer." "I hope so," said Emil. "The address is 15 Schumann Street, care of Heimbold. That's my uncle's name, and my aunt's too. You boys have done a fine job, said the big man, lighting a fat cigar. Yes, the other chaps were simply marvellous, said Emil enthusiastically. Gustav, the one with the motor horn, and the professor, and little Tuesday, and Crumb, and the Mittlers, and all the rest of them. Oh, it was great fun, and the professor was grand at organising things. Well, you didn't do too badly yourself, said the superintendent, puffing away at his cigar. May I ask you something, please? Emil said. What's going to happen to Grundy's or whatever his name is? He's being taken to the Identification Bureau, was the reply, to be photographed and have his fingerprints taken. Then we shall see if he's got any record of him already in the rogues gallery. Oh, what's that? Emil inquired. It's where we keep the records of all convicted criminals. We also have fingerprints and footprints and other information of people wanted in connection with various crimes, those still at large. Still at large means that they haven't been caught. They're still roaming free. It's quite possible that the man who robbed you has been in trouble before. We may even be looking for him already. Oh, I see, said Emil. I hadn't thought of that. Then the telephone rang. Excuse me, said the superintendent very politely, lifting the receiver. Yes? I've something here that would interest you. Come along to my room. And he hung up. Some gentlemen from the press, meaning newspaper people, journalists. Some gentlemen from the press want to interview you, he said. Oh, goodness, what does that mean? Well, they'll ask you a lot of questions. Gosh, does that mean my name will be in the papers? Well, I shouldn't wonder. When a schoolboy catches a thief, he becomes news. There was a knock at the door, and 4 men came in and shook hands with the superintendent. He told them briefly what had happened to Emil, and they scribbled it all down in their notebooks. Ah, what a story, said one of the reporters. Country boy turns detective. I suppose you'll be taking him on as a plainclothes man, one of the others suggested, laughing. A plainclothes man. Very quickly, the police are separated in between police who are uniformed police and police who are plainclothes. The plainclothes police are the detectives. And that's the same here as well. Right, I'm just going to stop there. That's end of part 1.